Well, hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the program so far. We are joined today by a good friend of mine and the industry, the FTC Commissioner, Rohit Chopra. And it's a pleasure to have you here with us in our studio, which also serves as the international headquarters for this enterprise here at AFSA. Your Daily Turbine Briefing has a full bio on the commissioner, so we're going to dispense with that and ask you to just review that so we can get into the questions and the discussion with the commissioner this morning. So it's good to see you. How are you? Let me give you a nice question to start with. How are you enjoying your time at the FTC?
You know, it's pretty terrific. I'll share this, that the COVID-19 crisis has actually reminded us about the importance of being able to look at problems throughout the markets to figure out how to solve them, whether it's, shortages in our pharmaceutical supply chains, if it's about now kids at school, at home, and all the data that might be collected on them. The issues are broad, and I think our society, our economy is changing. We need a government that can respond to that. So, we obviously have a lot of issues with a tricky economy, a public health crisis, and I think everyone is trying to come together to tackle those.
Great. Do you see greater collegiality as a result of the crisis that we're in?
Yeah, I would say, I've actually been lucky in all of this is technically my fourth agency. All of them are different, but I do think, there is generally a more of a shared sense of concern. For me, I've been most concerned about whether a lot of small enterprises are going to go extinct. So we really see millions of small businesses that
I think everybody's concerned about that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because typically places like the FTC are so focused on small scams rather than some of the bigger issues about our economy, including, the sustainability of small businesses. And millions of them are reporting that they think they might not survive. And a major area that I've been focused on is actually abuse of market power. So, there's a renewed interest in antitrust law, particularly when it comes to the big technology platforms that, many people believe pick and choose losers. It affects every part of our economy, particularly in digital advertising. There's privacy issues and also issues about whether there's fair treatment of small businesses. And a lot of that is much more front and center in the crisis right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talked about collegiality. I think that's in terms of market power and technology, at least from my perspective, that seems to be an area where Republicans and Democrats, come together with respect to, concerns about whether or not all the voices are being heard, that's very endearing, at least to me. I wanted to actually ask you two questions in one. What right now, and this may have something to do with the current situation we're in, but not necessarily. What are the priorities of the FTC? And before we went on air, we were talking a little bit about that, about your background in financial services. Yeah. What are the priorities of the FTC, and how are your priorities as an individual commissioner, distinct?
Yeah, so I'll speak for myself on things that I've been very focused on. One of the things, I've been really fortunate to have worked with the FTC for a while, including, starting 10 years ago when I was helping start the CFPB. And one of the things that I really want to make sure we're able to do is that we can effectively enforce laws rather than impose requirements and then not enforce them. So for me, the biggest losers of lack of enforcement are the honest businesses. And what I see as an issue at the FTC is a lot of things just go unenforced. And that's a problem for the businesses who do invest in making sure they're treating their customers right, they're following the law, because they are at a competitive disadvantage to those who are egregiously violating the law and nothing happens. So in one example,
I mean, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Is that due at least in part to the fact that the FTC has a huge scope, the entire economy, and trying to get your hands around?
That's totally true. I think the problem is that when we do enforce the law, we often pursue these no money, no fault settlements. And so it is sometimes appropriate to have a settlement with no money, particularly when there's significant disagreement about the facts, interpretation of the law. When you have egregious law breaking, it is totally inappropriate to do these no money, no fault settlements.
That's fair.
So for me, effective enforcement and ending these no consequences settlements for egregious law breaking is a major issue. I would say increasingly there's more agreement that we need to be getting money in more cases. And so a top issue that the FTC is currently facing relates to our authorities under Section 13B. So just to give some basic understanding of this, one of the authorities for the FTC to get money back for consumers who were victims of a law violation, the Supreme Court has granted cert in a number of cases that will decide whether we have that authority. And for me, I want to make sure that the market is clear that there will be some real consequences. And so part of what we've been looking at is figuring out ways that we can, instead of getting equitable monetary relief, that's like redress for essentially stolen funds, could we also use civil penalties as a way to leverage more redress for consumers? So I have been talking a lot about how we can codify existing legal precedent, and where there's consensus that there's law violation, that something is illegal, how can we codify that and restate it in a rule such that we can use civil penalties to further deter that conduct? The great part about this is that it's no new substantive burdens for anyone. Everyone already knows it's illegal, but actually there'll be some real consequences. So to me, figuring out how to make sure we're getting money for consumers is critical, and I think there's a lot of agreement on that. I personally am also very concerned about repeat offenders. So we've had several incidents, the most high profile being Facebook. Facebook was subject to an FTC order, almost 10 years ago. It was finalized in 2012. They violated that order immediately, repeatedly, and that's a problem. We cannot have the market thinking that the FTC's orders are just suggestions. And so for me, I have been quite focused on making sure that repeat offenders, we eliminate that, and that there's some real consequences for violating the law repeatedly.
Makes perfect sense. We talked about technology a couple minutes ago, and I know that near and dear to your heart is data privacy for consumers. How do you and the Commission marry up, the desire that we always have for innovation in the technology sphere with the very legitimate concerns that consumers have about their privacy and their data?
Yeah, so it's so interesting, Bill, because if you look in certain industries, healthcare and financial services included, there has been a lot more maturity and appreciation for protecting consumer data. Partially that's because there has been privacy laws in place for quite a bit of time. Mm-hmm. But for much of the economy, more enterprises are learning that monetization and abuse of consumer data can be very profitable. And so where I am is I'm very, very concerned about a particular type of business model, which is behavioral advertising or surveillance-based advertising. This is where companies like Facebook, Google can track you across the internet. Sometimes you're not even logged in or you may not even be a user. And the advertising is not just targeted at someone of a specific demographic. It sort of follows you across the digital world. And I think...
Oh, I'm familiar.
Oh, yeah.
Freaks me out a little bit.
Yeah, it is. And I think the challenge with it is that so many enterprises feel they have to use that advertising channel, otherwise they'll lose out. But you worry about companies like Facebook and Google, extracting a lot of rents from that transaction. And we want a competitive environment. We also have to worry about the national security elements of this. I think we used to think about data security and privacy a little bit more in the identity theft or sort of human values context. What we're seeing now, just let's list them. Equifax, Marriott, Anthem. The list goes on of major data breaches. And this was not a hacker trying to open a credit card at a department store. These were all state and non-state actors affiliated with China. Because I do think people realize that when you can collect and create massive amounts of data and create dossiers on every American, that is a way that they can get national security advantages of and undermine our society. And I do think that's partially why we see so much rancor and division, because there are those forces who wish to divide us. So I'm really worried about how that kind of surveillance-based advertising works. But to answer your question, I actually think we're not at the point yet where there's these huge trade-offs. We actually have a set of laws on the books about privacy. They need to be enforced. There is a prohibition on unfair and deceptive data practices. When companies lie about how they're securing your data or collecting your data, they need to live up to those promises. Obviously, Congress and the states are looking at a lot of different privacy protections. I think that's good. It will be good to have some legislative, boundaries on it, because that will incorporate all different concerns. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to think hard about whether we want a handful of actors in our economy having such detailed information about all of us, because they can then use that to extract value from businesses across the economy.
We talked about the laws that are on the books and enforcement. Even if we tighten up the laws, do you see, because I know it concerns me, a greater propensity in the next generation to, even with stricter data security laws, a willingness from the next generation, just hand over their data willy-nilly without as great a concern about their own privacy until it's too late?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think there's conventional wisdom that younger people are more willing to share personal data. I think that's not totally true from some of the research I see. I think in many ways people across age groups are sort of resigned to the fact that this data is going to be taken from them. And I actually worry most about older Americans who may not be as familiar with how to, manage some of the privacy policy statements, and no one reads those damn things anyway. So we have to think about.
Speaking of which, I'd love to work with you in the future to see if we can get privacy notices. Companies have the ability to deliver those electronically.
Yeah, and I think actually for a set of entities, the CFPB has done that. The Fed, I think, has applied it to some. But I think we also have to ask big picture, are these privacy notices worth anything?
Fair enough.
We need to be asking ourselves, are there some things that, policymakers came up with that really just don't serve any use? And are we better off with some clear framework on what you can and can't kind of collect or not collect? Which, by the way, financial services providers are already subject to some of that, but much of the economy is not. I'll tell you, I really think that data security, particularly in the regulated banking sector, but also outside, there's more awareness about encryption, about protecting that data, because a lot of financial services companies know that they'll face serious reputational damage and customer damage if that's lost. But some companies have consumer data, and the consumers don't even really know it. They're a middleman in the market, and that's where you really worry about, do they really care?
Well, it's 2020, and we've known each other for just about a decade. We met in the context of Dodd-Frank and the CFPB being set up back in 2010. With that perspective and hindsight, we just celebrated the passage of Dodd-Frank earlier this year, and I wanted to see if you had some perspective on, with 10 years under our belt, what's working well, what's not working well, what would you like to see changed, enhanced?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think I mentioned earlier that bugs me quite a bit is when regulators just decide, oh yeah, we're just not going to do that provision of the law. The problem with that, again, is you have a set of actors, which is the vast majority, who want to do the right thing, do good faith compliance, and then the regulators just don't enforce, This to me is a big problem. So you look at the FTC, which obviously, completely missed some of the key issues in the lead up to the subprime mortgage crisis, got a set of authorities in Dodd-Frank, and just essentially has decided to veto it, just not do it. So there's a few in particular, but one is the FTC has authority in the auto market to put into place rules that related to unfair deceptive practices. Now, there can be a debate about what those rules should be, but there should be some consensus that things that legitimate law-abiding companies all agree on is existing law. If it's codified and restated into a rule, we will have higher levels of deterrence. We will actually, and in the FTC context, if it's not in a rule, there's no civil penalties. It's harder to get consumer redress. The FTC should implement that. And when we implement things that everyone has already agreed are unlawful, but provide extra deterrence and are clear, bright lines, not this sort of hazy things that everyone has to guess about, that's something that we should be doing. I have I'll give you an example. We did a case that involved fake recall notices, where a dealer and maybe an affiliated firm, I don't recall exactly, sent out fake recall notices in order to bait drivers to come in. Every dealer I've ever spoken to agrees this is egregious. But the settlement was kind of a no money, no fault settlement, because we've never codified into rule that that's a prohibited practice. So for me, I'm disappointed that and the FTC is not alone on this, a long list of regulators, particularly on the regulated banking side, have had authorities that they were supposed to implement and have simply not done it. If they don't believe in it, we should argue that it should be repealed, those provisions. So when Congress says to put that into place, you worry about agencies that sort of zip their lips and do nothing on it. The other thing I would say about Dodd-Frank, I am worried. One of the great things about the CFPB was really the creation of a supervisory program for very large entities, particularly like credit bureaus and mortgage servicers. And those are some huge pain points in the market, and I think you need some more visibility into what they're up to. I do think that we need to look very, very hard at fixing our credit reporting industry. Credit reporting, their business model, consumers are not the customer. Consumers are the product. They can't exercise much power to discipline, particularly the big three credit reporting agencies. When you hear sometimes there's problems in reporting and the actual business is also struggling with that. And that's a big problem to me. So I think there's some unfinished business to be done, and I think credit reporting is very high on that list.
Right. You mentioned vehicle finance. As you know, that vehicle finance is a bedrock of our association membership. And in your tenure at the CFPB, we started work on vehicle finance guidance. What do you think is working in that area of consumer credit, and what isn't working? What would you like to address, either at the FTC or maybe in a different role down the road?
Well, I think we obviously, auto lending is a huge market. Right. Over $1 trillion, very, very critical for so many families. I will say big pain points for me are, I am worried that some of the indirect auto lending has incentivized some real problematic practices. But the top on that list is document falsification. So, according to some data from Refinitiv, as well as some enforcement actions the FTC has done, we have seen some dealers engaged in falsification of documents. Everyone agrees that this is a problem, and I think we need to figure out how we can aggressively kind of get rid of that type of fraud. There's also, other worries, I think, about...
And look, we would stand shoulder to shoulder with you in terms of trying to root out fraud. It's not good for the customer. It's not good for the industry.
Yeah, and you worry about what sort of I have raised concerns in the past about whether some indirect auto lenders, not all of them, but a very small group of them, maybe know that it's going on and are under pressure to meet certain targets when it comes to securitization volume goals, all of those things. So you get worried about that because it reminds us all about some of the kind of originate to distribute mortgage lending market. And so we need to figure out how some of that is just going to go away. The other thing on vehicle finance, I think we have to really think hard about...
Well, before you get into that, it would be my understanding that the laws that are on the books give the FTC and other regulators the authority to already go after fraud.
Oh, yeah.
And so, you don't see any need to change the law, just enforce it, right?
Yeah, it's funny. You're not going to hear me much talk about changing the law because I think the biggest gap is just lack of enforcement.
You've made that very clear.
Yeah, so I'll say this. I do have some worries about the use of the GPS tracker. I understand the business rationale for it, but I also want us to be thinking about, in a world of connected cars and in the world of a lot of data, what that GPS tracker data is being used for. I want to make sure that, if it's being sold and resold, have some concerns about that. But I will say there's ongoing discussions about how to address some of the issues with respect to fair lending. We recently did a case called Bronx Honda, where
there can be a lot of value associated with that for the consumer in terms of keeping the cost down for the consumer.
Oh, and actually, I think there's a little bit indirect auto lending. The dealer needs to be compensated for that retail element that they're doing, because the direct auto lender, they have those costs. It's think of it as a distribution piece. We want to make sure, though, that and all the dealers that I've spoken to, including their representatives in Washington, everyone wants to figure out how to make sure that there are not unexplained disparities. Right. And so, I do think there has been some proposals around, fair credit policies that, some of the industry groups have put together. I think everyone needs to figure out what's the best way to do that. Because the truth is when there are those problems and they're not addressed aggressively, it can paint an industry with a brush as if there's a problem with racial discrimination. And, the truth is, I think many dealers and their employees are not trying to do that. So you have to figure out the best ways to get rid of it if it is existing. That being said, I do think we have to reflect on broader issues in the auto market and get there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that I think just has not been enforced very aggressively.
I have a feeling we're going to have plenty of discussions about this very topic for years to come. So it's good that we have 10 years under our belt collectively. Let me switch over then and talk and get your thoughts on small dollar credit. And, what are some of the issues that you see there? There's been, pushes to have rate caps, both on Capitol Hill as well as in various states. Our position has always been that at those types of tools ultimately will cut out access to credit for those that probably need it most. But at the same time, I understand, that you need to be able to make sure that the customer is in a loan that they can afford. And our guys underwrite, and they don't make any money if the customer doesn't pay. But I'd love to get your thoughts on where you think the discussion is headed in that area.
So I think generally speaking, on small dollar, you're probably going to see a continued shift toward broader depth in terms of credit scorecards. So more use of alternative data and underwriting. We obviously have, interest in more machine learning, artificial intelligence, gathering alternative data. I think what we want to figure out is that the more that there is innovation in scorecards that are being used, we want to figure out how smaller enterprises and lenders can make sure that they're on the right side of the law in terms of doing backwards-looking analyses to determine whether everything is in line with the existing law. So I think I do favor, more continuous release of more guidance on how they can do that. You may know the FTC still enforces some of those laws. Not, in addition to the CFPB.
Right.
It's a little bit complicated in the context of motor vehicle dealers and auto finance because the Fed has a part. It's a little bit of a mishmash. But I do think that is a secular trend. And we're going to need to make sure that we're figuring out what's the right analytical approach to do it. Now, I will say, though, that it's going to be interesting to see how small dollar lending evolves through the next credit cycle. So none of us can predict, but it does feel like we're moving into a cycle that may be more constrained. There's a lot of liquidity in the market, a lot of demand in the capital markets. But if in fact we're in a prolonged state of higher unemployment, There's obviously going to be more demand for certain types of credit, and so it will be a challenge. I will say though, one of my goals for the FTC has been to work more with the state banking supervisors, because I think it's important for people to kind of be on the same page and think about it together rather than kind of all being at odds with each other.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, Rohit, I always enjoy our time together. I want to thank you very much for coming to our makeshift studio, if you will. It's very insightful comments and conversation, and wish you all the best for the rest of the year, and hopefully we can come out of this and not have to worry so much about social distancing.
Yeah, well, and thanks again for having me. I know this is probably a very different conference than you all are used to, but we have a lot of challenges, I think, in our country, our economy, our world. So glad everyone is staying plugged in and figuring out how to solve these.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for again tuning in, everyone, and we'll see you at our next segment. Thank you very much.